Welcome to session 84 of the Worlds of Speculative Fiction. We are diving once again into Terry Pratchett's Diskworld. This time around, you notice I've got these novels here. We're going to be looking at the stories that center around death as a character and also as, you might say, a cosmic entity. And as usual with this narrative universe, you pull one thread, you pull about 20 others. So there's a number of other characters and developments that we're going to have to go into, including Death's apprentice, his adopted daughter, his granddaughter, the woman who he works for when he decides to retire and enjoy himself, and so many others as well, including entities that are truly cosmic in proportion. So before we jump in, if you're new to this series, let me tell you what Worlds of Speculative Fiction is. So this is a series that we originally did in person, hosted at the Brookfield Public Library. It offered me the chance as an academic and philosopher to go back to great series of short stories or novels that constituted a narrative universe by classic science fiction, fantasy, horror, and other speculative fiction authors who I wanted to reread. And so I would come in and give a talk and people would participate. And you can see all the videos for that in the playlist, or if you sign up for the class, all the videos are linked to there. That went on from 2016 to 2020, monthly. And then in 2020, as we all know, we went online because of the COVID lockdown. So we didn't do sessions for a while. And then I decided to do things in this newer format. We've been doing this now for roughly 4 years, where I do a video premiere. We have live chat, so do feel free to engage in discussion in the chat about these texts, about Pratchett, about speculative fiction more generally, and I'll respond to it. And then we have a Zoom session afterwards to do a little bit more in-depth discussion and catching up with each other. And then, of course, you can leave comments. If you missed the video premiere, you can always leave comments about this, and I will respond to them. So that is what we do. Every month it's a not necessarily new author, not necessarily a new series, but certainly a new set of stories. So we've done Pratchett once before, focusing on 5 novels that have to do with the character Rincewind. Very fun stuff. Now we're going to be looking at novels that have to do with death. So let me tell you what they are, and I'll do this in order of their publication. First, we have Mort. Mort is Death for a while. Mort is Death's apprentice. And we're going to see a lot of interesting stuff with him. Then we have Reaper Man, really about not just Death himself, but quite a few other characters. But Death plays a major role in this. Then we have Soul Music, and we're getting to learn a bit more about Death's family. We have Hogfather, legendary character in Diskworld, the Hogfather, but Death is also involved in this one. And then finally, Thief of Time, in part because time is a very important commodity and literary theme, as we're going to see while we go through these. So we already did a session on Pratchett. I don't think we need to go into any more biography. Maybe we'll look at a few things that Pratchett himself has to say about Death as a character and about these novels in particular. But for the most part, we're going to be exploring the world that is revealed, the world building that goes on through the narration in these various novels. And we'll be talking about some of the important philosophical themes. There's a lot of them in this. And, we're looking at, you could call them somewhat genre-straddling books because they are fantasy, definitely fantasy literature. They're also humor. There's a lot of that packed in here. It's sort of like what Douglas Adams does for science fiction, Terry Pratchett is doing for fantasy, but at much, much greater length and in greater depth, you could say. So that's probably enough about what we're doing as an introduction. We're going to jump right in and start talking about the things that are really key in these novels. So these 5 books constitute a sequence within Diskworld. If you're not familiar with it, there's a number of organizational principles, let's call them, centered on particular characters. So there are the Rincewind books, there's City Guard books, and we have the Death books. And so these 5 are particularly important. Death is actually in almost all of the books of Diskworld, but he's only a major character in these 5, and we see character development taking place, plus a number of important relationships with other characters who are brought in, some of whom span a number of books, some of whom are only found in one particular book but play an important role within that one. So before we jump into looking at world building, let's talk just a little bit about the sequence that we have here and where they fit into the Diskworld series. So the first book is Mort. This is the 4th book in the series, so we're talking about relatively early on. Pratchett is making a decision to explore a bit about this death character. I was going to say death guy, and yes, he is gendered, but is he really a guy? I mean, I suppose you could say he becomes one by the time that we're getting to Reaper Man. So what is happening in this book? This is from 1987. It's titled Mort, and Mort or Mortimer. I mean, Mort is also the French word for death, right? But Mortimer is a relatively poor, not particularly knowledgeable kid who becomes Death's apprentice. And Death has decided at this point in time, he probably could use an apprentice. And we're going to get introduced not just to Mort himself and Death, but to some other important characters as well. For example, Isabel, Death's adopted daughter, who is stuck in at least at that point of the story, a perpetual being 16. Although, as it turns out, she ages normally up until 16, and then she's stuck there, and I think she's the equivalent of 35 years old. And she comes in earlier books. Death saves her and then decides to take her along to his domain. We also meet Albert, who at one time was a massively influential wizard in the Unseen University. So he's going to play an important role, running actually as kind of a bit player most of the time through all of the works, although I would say he probably has the biggest role, maybe in Hogfather. And anyway, we'll come back to that. So we learn a lot in Mort, and then it's a while. It's the 11th book that is Reaper Man. So, 6 other books in between, and here we pick up the story of Mort and Isabel, and it's going to turn out that, Death is going to not take a holiday, but retire. And we're going to find out that, he can take on humanity to a certain degree. I mean, he's still a skeleton, as kids can discern. And he's going to, you might say, break the rules that he imposed earlier on Mort and undo some of the lessons about, for example, saving people that he had imparted to Mort, how, saving people can really screw things up. And what we're going to meet up with, really interestingly, is all sorts of other, what would we call them? Characters. There's Wendell Poons, and there's all sorts of interesting developments of people not dying who ought to be dying or not staying dead. And we're going to find other deaths are going to arise and then eventually be more or less replaced, right? So that's what's happening in Reaper Man. And we're getting more and more of the universe as this is happening. Soul Music is the 16th book, and this is a bit thicker. This is a longer one. This is one where Susan Stohellet, who is the daughter of Mort and Isabel, so she is Death's grandchild, she is going to come to prominence, but so are some other characters. And this, Soul Music, it's about a music scene, essentially rock music, or the music that has rocks in it is how it's talked about. And there's a lot of parody of things that are, in our music scene from, say, the 1950s through, this is written in the 1990s. It comes out in 1994. So there's a lot of references there. And we're going to get introduced to more and more interesting characters as well. Another big consequence of saving somebody who perhaps, strictly speaking, shouldn't have been saved arises. And then we get to what is probably, among Pratchett fans, the number one favorite book. And it's interesting. You notice I've got all of these that are in kind of a standard format. These are all from the local Milwaukee library. But this one was different. Hogfather was available in hardcover. Why hardcover? Because it's getting checked out more often than the other books because it's so beloved. Now, who is the Hogfather? Essentially, Santa Claus, except in the Diskworld. And he maybe goes further back, St. Nicholas in our world goes back to 3rd or 4th century. I'm a little bit hazy on which. And doesn't become Santa Claus until, I think, after the medieval period. He's actually a saint who's prayed to a lot. Anselm, for example, has a prayer to St. Nicholas, but the Santa Claus as we know him is a more recent phenomenon. The Hogfather is an anthropomorphism who, sort of like death, has been brought into existence by human beings, and he comes around every, end of the year in the darkest days of winter and brings people all sorts of pork-related matters. On Hog's Watch night, like Santa Claus, he goes around the entire Diskworld in one night and, modifies time, of course, in the process in doing so. And, interestingly, in this book, death takes over as the Hogfather because it looks like the Hogfather's been taken out of commission and death has a stake in people believing. So he takes up the mantle. Susan Stohellet develops further in this. They are opposed to, a very interesting character who's introduced to us in, I believe, the very first few pages after we learn about Susan. It's the assassins, and we find out that the assessors are also playing a role in this. And so we get Mr. It's spelled tea time, but he actually prefers it be pronounced Tea Time. And so we'll talk about what's going on there shortly. And then finally, I should mention, so Hogfather, 20th book in the series, 1997, so you see kind of a sequence. Finally, we have Thief of Time, 26th book in the series, published in 2001. So we're talking about a span from 87 to 2001. And this is going to bring in not just Death and Susan in important ways, but a number of other characters as well, including some who are descended from Time herself. Time is gendered feminine in this cosmos. And we're going to get a lot more about these assessors, including some interesting developments that take place as they take on human corporeal form and discover the universe through, let's call it a sensorium, right? So those are the books that we are going to be exploring here. And I've already given you a little bit of premise to each of them. I should mention Thief of Time. One of the things that's going on there is the assessors want to bring an end to the universe. At least the universe as human beings have messed it up. So they have this clock being built for the second time by a ideal clock maker, we could say. And there's monks involved who are going to try to prevent this from happening. Susan, of course, plays a very important role. Death, meanwhile, is trying to put back together the band, not just 4 horsemen, but 5. He tracks down the ones that we think of. I mean, he's one of them. And then we have war and pestilence and famine. But there's also Chaos, who has been he actually left the band of horsemen early on. It's sort of like a Beatles story, right? And we find, interestingly, that Chaos has been spending his time as a dairy producer who also occasionally sells eggs and is thinking about getting into lines of cheese. Mr. Soak, which is actually Chaos backwards. So we have a lot to delve into in terms of characters, development, plot, philosophical themes, but we should talk about the world in which this is taking place as well. So let's talk about world building now. In each of these volumes, the Diskworld and, we could say, adjacent things, wider things, are being expanded because it doesn't look like Pratchett at any one given time had like a big blueprint in his head and a map the way that somebody like Tolkien or even, George R. Martin or Ursula K. Leguin, who are much more gardener types than architect types, to use our typology for world building, ever did. Ursula K. Le Guin quite famously said that she made a map of Earthsea and used it to locate, Ged, where he's going in the first tale of Earthsea, a wizard of Earthsea, and then starts saying, well, let's explore this place over here. Let's explore this place over here. And we can see Pratchett doing that in a somewhat different way. So we pick up not just lands, but also characters. So I mentioned that Death is there from the beginning. He's trying to get to Rincewind. He doesn't actually have that much of a role until we get to Mort, right? And he doesn't necessarily play a major role in many of the other books, but just in these 5. So that's a great example of what's going on. And we see that a lot of the major institutions and locations are going to get further fleshed out. And then with each book, Pratchett will introduce new locations, all within, let's say, the universe of Discworld. So we should talk about what Discworld actually is. It is indeed a disk, a flat disk rather than a globe, on top of a giant turtle who is traveling within the universe. At a certain point in time, the sun actually is going to become a luminous ball of gas, but that's not the case in most of these stories. And people live, not just people as human beings, but all sorts of anthropoid races, goblins, trolls, we encounter dwarves, right? Many others as well, and all sorts of cultures living on the Diskworld as this turtle takes them through the universe. A lot of the story will center on the great city, kind of a common trope of Moorcock, which is a dynamic, rundown, stinky, chaotic place ruled officially by a sort of lord, the patrician. But there's all these guilds, and there's the unseen university where, of course, the wizards are. We kind of start the story there, and then there's all sorts of other lands around this great city as well, some of which are quite distant. And then we also have other worlds besides this out in the universe, and we have a cosmos in which, for example, death is the death of the Diskworld, but there's an even greater death who is the death of the entire universe. Azrael, you can call him an angel if you want to, but he's really more like a all caps God who handles those sorts of things. There's the assessors, the auditors rather, and these are all within the same narrative universe. Now, in addition to that, we have realms, you could call them. So Death has his own realm, which we start learning about in Mort, For example, he's got a nice house that he lives in, really sort of a manor. And it's got, a library that contains books that tell us about human beings. There's all sorts of other wings. There's stables, which is what Mort is mucking out at the very beginning. There's beautiful gardens, at least beautiful if you like all black, because that's how Death conceives of things and never really understood color. So there's wonderful flowers, just all different shades of black. And we could go on and on from there. There are other realms as well. The Tooth Fairy, who actually turns out to be a boogeyman, the original boogeyman, has their own realm, which is like a child's drawing. So Death can't actually get in there because children don't understand death, and it's not part of the drawing. And there's other realms as well that can be accessed. There's even dimensions that are talked about, like, the dungeon dimension. You don't want things coming through from there. So Pratchett is building all of this out kind of, I won't say on the fly, because that sounds a little bit too ramshackle. But it is a universe that has not only its sort of rules, but rules that, of course, are broken in the process, and entities that do things, that run things, that are responsible for things. And then there's this vast variety of people, which includes humans, and human beings are discussed in this as sort of, upsetting things, but they're also interested in normality. So human beings, and this is where we'll end talking about world building, human beings with all their various proclivities are part of what Death gets interested in. And he is going to end up becoming humanized through his curiosity about people and trying on different roles. He's in the Foreign Legion. He takes up a job as essentially farmhand. He takes up a couple other jobs as well. He does the hogfather thing, which includes not just going around and doing all the present thing, but being a hogfather in a department store and having children come in and giving them presents after they sit on his lap. So this is going to be a really central theme of these works. And, there's one other thing that I do want to bring up, at least in this, before we talk about one other really massively important feature of this world. So here in these novels, we are not just getting to learn about death and the various people that he engages with. We're getting to learn about death as the central figure in a household, in a family. So Albert has been with him for 2,000 years, and Albert is, kind of a servant, but he also can sometimes contradict death and say, hey, you should be doing this instead. We have other deaths that will arise. So, in Reaper Man, for example, we're going to see that all of the animals have their own deaths, and the death of rats is the only one that death doesn't reabsorb into himself when he reasserts his control over things. And the death of rats will wind up, riding a skeletal. Death wants it to ride a dog. He wants to ride a cat. He takes rats when they die, and he'll play a role with Susan at various points. There's also a raven whose name is Quoth the Raven from Edgar Allan Poe, who talks a lot, helps out quite a bit. And then we have these people, right? So we have Mort, an apprentice. We have Isabel, Death's daughter. They get married. They have a child, Susan, who outlives her parents and will end up, each one of them, primarily Mort and Susan, will end up stepping in for death and taking over some of the job. There's even another death when the original death is forced into retirement, who will arise, and he's kind of off-putting to the original death, who will do him in eventually, right? So one other feature I do want to mention, and then we'll talk about the next section. How do you know when death or somebody who is a stand-in for death, because death is both a personage and a phenomenon. People die, and then death is there to handle what goes on next. So how can you tell that it's death? All caps, right? That's a part of the dialogue. Now, Susan can turn that on when she wants to later on in the stories. And she's a very interesting character. We'll talk a bit more about her down the line. So that's probably enough about the world building and death's familial relations and how these books fit in for the time being. So one of the topics that we really do need to explore is what it is that Pratchett does in these books with, let's just call it belief, because that is the term that he uses for it. And I'm going to begin with a long passage from Reaper Man, where he's being kind of programmatic about this. He tells us, belief is one of the most powerful organic forces in the multiverse. It may not be able to move mountains exactly, but it can create someone who can. People get exactly the wrong idea about belief. They think it works back to front. They think that the sequence is first object, then belief. In fact, it works the other way. Belief sloshes around in the firmament like lumps of clay spiraling into a potter's wheel. That's exactly how gods get created, for example. They clearly must be created by their own believers, because a brief resume of the lives of most gods suggests that their origins couldn't possibly be divine. They tend to do exactly the things people would do, if only they could, especially when it comes to nymphs, golden showers, and the smiting of your enemies. Belief creates other things. It created death. Not death, which is merely a technical term for a state caused by prolonged absence of life, but death, the personality. He evolved, as it were, along with life. As soon as a living thing was even dimly aware of the concept of suddenly becoming a non-living thing, there was death. He was death long before humans ever considered him. They only added the shape and all the scythe and robe business to a personality that was already millions of years old. Now, in this part of the story, and now he had gone. But belief doesn't stop. Belief goes right on believing. And since the focal point of belief had been lost, because death is retiring and going to die himself, which he doesn't actually do, new points sprang up. Small as yet not very powerful, the private deaths of every species no longer united but specific. In the stream, black-scaled, swam the new death of mayflies. In the forest, invisible, a creature sound only, drifted the chop-chop of the death of trees. Over the desert, a dark and empty shell moved purposively, half an inch above ground, the death of tortoises. The death of humanity hadn't been finished yet. Humans can believe some very complex things. It's like the difference between off the peg and bespoke. So it's a really nice, succinct summary of how belief works in the Diskworld. So, who else has been created by belief? Well, the Tooth Fairy, the Boogeyman, the Hogfather, the other three horsemen of the apocalypse, war, death, and famine. And originally they were kind of smaller. There's a hint that there's others who were not really created by belief, like, for example, the fifth horseman who left the band, Chaos, or on an even bigger scale, Azrael, the death of the universe, because humans are only just a tiny portion of the universe. But there's so many other things that are indeed created and given their energy by belief. For example, we're going to discover in some of these other stories, for example, in Hogfather, that you've got a bit of misplaced belief. As the Hogfather is taken out by Mr. Tea Time, I'm just going to use our normal pronunciation, the belief in the Hogfather spills over into all sorts of other things and allows the generation of all sorts of entities. For example, the creature that devours socks in the unseen university. Anything you can think of, that belief can flow into it and make it something. So there are a number of interesting ramifications to this. Belief creates anthropomorphic personifications like death, like the Hogfather, like the Tooth Fairy, like all sorts of other entities as well. And belief sustains them in existence. But because it's humans believing, it also gives them a lot of their characteristics. There's talk in Thief of Time, as Death is trying to put the band back together, that humans gave them their fingers, for example. Another really interesting feature has to do with the afterlife that one is going to experience. And this is kind of an arbitrary, perhaps unfair aspect of both belief and of death. So we are going to find, as Mort is taking over before death, and actually I'm going to just read this particular line or passages, which is not directly about belief, but shows you somebody stepping into the function. So Mort is talking with Isabel, and he has already sort of assumed the role of death. And they're looking at these tombs, the Sortian priests, which we'll come back to in just a moment. And she says, "Doesn't it send shivers up your spine?" "No," said Mort flatly. "Why not?" And now in all caps, "Because I am Mort." He turned and she saw his eyes glow like blue pinpoints. "Stop it." "I can't." She tried to laugh. It didn't work. "You're not Death. You're only doing his job." And then Mort says, "Death is whoever does Death's job." The shocked pause that followed this was broken by a groan from further along the dark passage. Mort turned on his heel and hurried towards it. "He's right," thought Isabel, "even the way he moves." But the fear of the darkness that the light was dragging towards her overcame any other doubts, and she crept after him. And she says, "What is this place? I've never seen so much stuff." "The king takes it with him into the next world," Mort said. And what we find out is that there's all these people who are servants for the king. The priests give them poison. Why? Because when they die, they think they're all going to be in the same afterlife as servants of the king. And they meet a girl. Mort actually says they think it takes them to paradise. Isabel says, "Does it?" And Mort says, "Maybe. Who knows?" So they find this girl, and she says, "My lord." And he says, "No one's lord. Now run along to wherever you believe you're going." She says, "I shall be a concubine at the heavenly court of King Zesaput, who will dwell among the stars forever." And Isabel says, "You don't need to be." And the girl says, "Oh, but I must. I've been training for it. I've only managed to be a handmaiden up till now." Right? And then Isabel says, "But it can't be true about King Huzus dwelling among the stars. There's nothing but empty space up there." And then Mort says, "It's hard to explain. He'll dwell among the stars in his own mind. With slaves, if that's what they think they are. That's not very fair. There's no justice," Mort says, "just us." And that's another key theme that will come up that we'll talk about later. There's no justice, just death. So, an interesting take on the afterlife. We get another one in soul music, a little vignette of a different afterlife. So we find that there's a guy who has died, and Susan is sort of being Death at this point and leading him to where he's supposed to go. And we read, "After it, mounted on a horse almost as fine as Binky, was a woman, very definitely, a lot of woman. She was as much woman as you could get into one place without getting two women. She was dressed in chainmail, a shiny 46 D-cup breastplate, and a helmet with horns on it. The assembled dead cheered as the horse cantered in for a landing. There were 6 other singing horsewomen plunging out of the sky behind it. 'Isn't it always the same?' said the raven, flapping away. 'You can wait hours without seeing one, and then you get 7 all at once.' Susan watched in astonishment as each rider picked up a dead warrior and galloped up into the sky again. Soon there was a busy shuttle service operating. After a minute or two, one of the women trotted her horse over to Susan and pulled a scroll of parchment out of her breastplate. 'What ho! Says here Wolf,' she said in the brisk voice used by people on horseback when addressing mere pedestrians. 'Wolf the Lucky.' 'I don't know. I don't know which one he is,' said Susan helplessly. The helmeted woman leaned forward. There was something rather familiar about her. 'Are you new?' 'Yes. Yes.' 'Well, don't just stand there like a big girl's blouse. Jolly well go and fetch him. There's a good sport.' Susan looked about wildly, saw him at last. He wasn't far away. A youngish man outlined in flickering pale blue was visible among the fallen. Susan hurried over, scythe at the ready. There was a blue line connecting the warrior to his former body. Squeak! Shouted the death of rats, jumping up and down and making suggestive motions. Left hand thumb up, right hand bent at the wrist. Give it some welly, shouted the horned woman. Susan swung the scythe. The line snapped. What happened? Said Wolf. He looked down. Oh, that's me there, isn't it? He turned slowly and down there and over there. He looked at the horned female warrior and brightened up. By lo, he said, it's true, Valkyries will carry me off to the hall of blind Io, where there is perpetual feasting and drinking. Don't ask me, said Susan. The Valkyrie reached down and hauled the warrior across her saddle. Just keep quiet, there's a good chap, she said. She stared thoughtfully at Susan, and then she asked her about, singing and stuff like that. Susan then is going to say, what was that all about? The raven alighted on the head of the recently departed wolf. Well, these guys believe that if you die in battle, some big, fat, singing horned woman carry you off to some sort of giant feast hall where you gobble yourself silly for the rest of eternity. It belched genteelly. Damn stupid idea, really. But it just happened. Still a daft idea. So you can go to Valhalla if you think that you're going to go to Valhalla. You can, go to hell or heaven if you think you're going there. And it even applies to reincarnation. In Thief of Time, Death is going to meet up with a monk, and we're going to find out, his name is Chaublong, that they're a little bit off on the timing. So he says, if I'm too early, then can't you? And Death says, everything that happens stays happened. What kind of philosophy is that? The only one that works. Death took out an hourglass and consulted it. I see that because of this problem, you're not due to reincarnate for 79 years. Do you have anywhere to stay? Stay? I'm dead. It's not like locking yourself out of your own house, said Chaublong, who was beginning to fade. Perhaps you could be bumped up to an earlier birth. Chaublong vanished. In the timeless moment, Death turned back to stare at the Hall of Spinners. Right? So people who think they're going to be reincarnated get reincarnated. This is the way it works for all sorts of people. You determine your afterlife based on the belief you have in it. Now, that does seem arbitrary. That does seem unfair. What if you have stupid beliefs about an afterlife that you're going to go to a terrible place? Well, you're stuck with that. And Death doesn't try to talk people into a better idea of an afterlife. What else do we need to say about belief? Well, there are some other interesting things that are going to come up, particularly in Hogfather. It's a great work for that. And we're going to read about Susan. And here we get something that's a bit of a twist. So we're taking a bit of a departure here. She has charges as a governess who believe in all sorts of scary monsters. These are children, right? So the previous governess had used various monsters and boogeymen as a form of discipline. There was always something waiting to eat or carry off bad boys and girls for crimes like stuttering or defiantly and aggravatingly persisting in writing with their left hand. There was always a scissor man waiting for a little girl who sucked her thumb, always a boogeyman in the cellar. Of such bricks is the innocence of childhood constructed. Susan's attempts at getting them to disbelieve in the things only caused the problems to get worse. Twyla had started to wet the bed. This may have been a crude form of defense against the terrible clawed creature she was certain lived under it. Susan had found out about this one the first night when the child had woken up crying because of a boogeyman in the closet. She'd sighed and gone to have a look. She'd been so angry she'd pulled it out, hit it over the head with the nursery poker, dislocated its shoulder as a means of emphasis, and kicked it out of the back door. The children refused to disbelieve in the monsters because, frankly, they knew damn well the things were there. But, here's where we get a very interesting twist. She found that they could very firmly also believe in the poker. And the children's belief in the poker turns it into an instrument that can, disable, even kill monsters, and so she uses it. And actually, by the end of the book, she's going to kill Mr. Tea Time with that. Later on, we're going to read about Susan and her upbringing. Susan had never hung up a stocking for, Hogfather's night. She'd never looked for eggs laid by the soul cake duck. She'd never put a tooth under her pillow in the serious expectation a dentally inclined fairy would turn up. It wasn't that her parents didn't believe in such things. They didn't need to believe in them. Belief is something different, a modality, right? So what did they do? They knew they existed. They just wished they didn't. Oh, there had been presents at the right time with a careful label saying who they were from, and a superb egg on soul cake morning filled with sweets. Juvenile teeth earned no less than $1 from her father without argument, but it was all straightforward. She knew now they'd been trying to protect her. She hadn't known that her father had been Death's apprentice for a while, and that her mother was Death's adopted daughter. She had very dim recollections of being taken a few times to see someone who had been, quite jolly in a strange, thin way, and the visits had suddenly stopped. And she met him later, and yes, he had his good side, and for a while she wondered why her parents had been so unfeeling. She knew now why they tried to keep her away. There was more to genetics than little squirmy spirals. So she has a different kind of status than others do. The other passage I want to read from Hogfather about this is, we've got a computer called Hex being developed in it at the Unseen University, and Ridiculi is talking with Death. And so Ridiculi is talking about all these extra things that have been brought into being by belief. He says, I've got little devils running around the place eating socks and pencils. Earlier tonight we sobered up someone who thinks he's a god of hangovers, and half my wizards are trying to cheer up the cheerful fairy. We thought something must have happened to the Hogfather. We were right then, right? Hex was right, Arch-Chancellor. Ponder corrected him. Hex? What is Hex? This is Death. Hex thinks, that is, calculates, there's been a big change in the nature of belief today, said Ponder. He felt, he did not know why, that Death was probably not in favor of unliving things that thought. Mr. Hex was remarkably astute. The Hogfather has been, Death paused. There is no sensible human word. Dead in a way, but not exactly. A god cannot be killed. Never completely killed. He has been, shall we say, severely reduced. Ye gods, said Ridiculi, who would want to kill off the old boy? He has enemies. What did he do, miss a chimney? Every living thing has enemies. What, everything? Yes, everything, powerful enemies, but they have gone too far this time. Now they're using people. Then we're talking about the auditors here as well. And what have they done? Well, through an agent, Mr. Tea Time, they have taken out the Hogfather. Who steps in to keep belief in the Hogfather going? Death. And so, interestingly, people can take Death's place because Death is something that is believed in. Death can do that for another entity like the Hogfather to keep reality of a certain sort going within this world. And I'm going to bring up one other passage that is connected with belief, but also adds to the picture a little bit. So it runs like this. You had to hand it to human beings. They had one of the strangest powers in the universe. Even her grandfather, so this is Susan, had remarked upon it. No other species anywhere in the world had invented boredom. Perhaps it was boredom, not intelligence, that propelled them up the evolutionary ladder. Trolls and dwarves had it too, that strange ability to look at the universe and think, oh, the same as yesterday. How dull! I wonder what happens if I bang this rock on that head. And then along with this had come the contrary power to make things normal. The world changed mightily, and within a few days, humans considered it was normal. They had the most amazing ability to shut out and forget what didn't fit. Now, how's that connected to belief? To believe that things are different than they are and to not believe in what's actually in front of your face. Like, for example, that you're seeing death. Most human beings can't see death as death until they die, of course. So they told themselves little stories to explain away the inexplicable, to make things normal. And here we're going to get to a really important insight and feature, which is kind of reflective on Pratchett's own projects. Historians were especially good at it. If it suddenly looked as though hardly anything had happened in the 14th century, they'd weigh in with 20 different theories. Not one of them would be that most of the time had been cut out and pasted into the 19th century, where the crash had not left enough coherent time for anything that needed to happen, because it only takes a week to invent the horse collar. The history monks had done their job well, but their biggest ally was the human ability to think narratively. That is, in terms of stories, a beginning, an end, things connected. And humans had risen to the occasion. They'd say things like, "Thursday already? What happened to the week? And time seems to go a lot faster these days. And it seems like only yesterday." But some things remained, right? So this is a kind of interesting way to close off these reflections on belief. Now, this ties in with world building, the mechanics of the universe, and it's also massively important in the plots within these Diskworld novels. In our previous session that was devoted to Terry Pratchett's Diskworld series, where we focused on the Rincewind books, we had a long segment where we looked at what Terry Pratchett said about his own writing and world building and Diskworld in particular. And as I looked around online for interviews where maybe Pratchett had said something about the Death books in particular, I didn't find much, but I did find a lot of interesting takes by other people, including some academic papers and even master's theses and bachelor's, I guess you could call them theses as well, which talked about these and explored them in ways that I think are thought-provoking. So I'm going to share a bit of that with you here, and maybe it'll be good, what would you call it, good grounds for further discussion about this stuff. So I'm going to begin with something that's from a website, and it's titled Terry Pratchett Book Club, Mort, Part 3, and it's by Emmett Asher Perrin, who tells us that various characters tell us that Death doesn't really understand emotions at all because he doesn't have glands or whatever, but his confusion over existence is an entirely human thing regardless. The conversation that Death is having during the Serpent Dance is absolutely a conversation I've had with people about things they find fun that just don't resonate with me, and a conversation I've heard other people have. It's a familiar conundrum in trying to relate to people, and then the way he tries to convince himself it's fun by repeating it is just very relatable is all I'm saying, and that's Death's charm as a character, the fact that these things he's learning are not very far off from what we all do. And I actually think that's quite right. Death is a quite relatable character for those of us who, at one point or another, have found ourselves confused by what other people are doing and seem to understand quite well, and we just can't wrap our heads around it. Even though we're trying and we're asking questions, it just doesn't fit for us. And sometimes it takes multiple tries, and I think that is something that we do see in these books. Death is progressively becoming more and more, if not human, because Death can never be truly human, humanized, right? And he goes on and he says, what's happening to Mort is certainly the more dynamic part of the story, of course, with his myriad of mistakes and his becoming too real and his threats to poor old Albert, all to save a princess he barely knows for reasons he doesn't fully understand. But for me, it really all comes down to this, and here's a quote, "It struck Mort with sudden, terrible poignancy that Death must be the loneliest creature in the universe. In the great party of creation, he was always in the kitchen. So being in the kitchen means being outside of the party and not knowing how to blend in. He goes on, it's also in the difference between mort and death as someone with human experience and someone without. Albert's fear of mort death, because he has, quote, the human seasonings of vengeance and cruelty and distaste, is a right thing to be terrified about. Death may well be learning about human experience, but even when he's pulling drowned kittens out of a well, he doesn't go out in search of revenge on the person who put them there. That's not what his existence is geared towards. It makes death a very special sort of deity. Of course, he's not a god, not in the Diskworld sense, but I would argue that he is very much so in Pratchett's own worldview, I guess you'd call it, and there's something genuinely comforting about the thought of a godly figure who dispenses literally no judgment. There's something pure and crystalline in that intention. It makes you genuinely sad for the fact that people don't appreciate him. It makes you wish he could have had that life as a line cook with all those cats about. So I think those are some interesting reflections on this character Death, most of which I would find myself in agreement with. Now we come to an academic paper by Tatiana Knazevova, The Concept of Death in Terry Pratchett's Diskworld series. And she writes, most of the time, death oscillates between doing his duty as need be and trying to understand humans. Two great motivations, right? In Mort, he wishes to learn about being human. Being Death has become a job for him, going out on his rounds like a milkman, so he chooses to take an apprentice. And so he tries fishing, dancing, gambling, and drink, allegedly 4 of life's greatest pleasures, and wasn't sure that he saw the point. He tried hard to learn what does it mean to have fun, and all the time he was inquiring about it. He even ended up looking for a new job, which, as he explained to an employee of Moorcock Personal Agency, hoped to include flowers or kittens. Being severely unskilled, he finds it hard to find work as an experienced Sith wielder, right? So he ends up working as a cook and feeding the neighborhood cats. As has already been mentioned, Death is depicted as one of the most humane characters in the Diskworld stories, right? He tries to understand what it means to be human so hard that he focuses on life far more than humans themselves. This idea is very relevant for current society where people avoid thinking and speaking about death and somehow subconsciously behave as if they were to live forever and thus forget to live at all. Only people who think about death as something natural are capable of living a fulfilling life and avoid loads of unnecessary activities or things that really are unimportant for life, but we think of them as such. So let's pause on that for a moment. That's a really interesting set of observations. So first of all, it's kind of a commonplace, I think, in philosophical literature and other more literary literature that a lot of people don't pay attention to what really matters, and they focus on trivialities and things that are superficial, like where they fit into society and, where their next big purchase is going to be, to keep up with the Joneses. And, when you place that in the context of the fact that we're all going to die, those things start to pale in comparison. And so, we could read into here, we could just take Heidegger as an example. Everybody's got being towards death and anxiety, but we all hide it from ourselves, or most of us hide it from ourselves with distractions and chatter and everydayness. And, you might know this shtick already. If you haven't heard it through Heidegger, you've probably heard it through somebody else because many people have taken up that common theme. So that is in fact the case in Diskworld. And, we know that a lot of people don't see death precisely because they've got other things on their mind. Most people in Diskworld are not paying attention most of the time, right? Death himself, to go back a little bit earlier, is this very humane character because he's very interested in human beings and human meanings, even though he doesn't really understand them. He has to struggle And it's not just that he doesn't have the right answers. He doesn't even have the right answers about the right answers about the right answers, the right questions about the right answers, whatever we want to call it. It's a complicated process, but he does work his way through it in these novels, along with his family members and colleagues and friends and things like that. All right, so going on, it says, Death himself, since he is the only one, feels very alone, standing outside of humanity, and he opens up to a barman in the Broken Drum, talking about how they all hate him and he does not have a single friend while actively trying to get drunk, which is once more impossible for Death. He talks about and ponders the purpose of living, what future shall bring, and asks the questions which would be far more understandable in characters who are actually human. So Pratchett is doing something really quite interesting in making Death one of the people who is exploring these questions. Susan, his granddaughter, says about him that he always gets these human things wrong because, quote, he saw life from outside and never quite understood. In practice, it means that his house is full of unusable versions of things humans use, like a bed hard as marble with stone sheets, or a toilet without functional plumbing. Or we could think of his garden of, flowers that are all black, and we could go on and on and on about that sort of thing. In another of these, this is a much longer piece, Not Cruel, Blessed or Merciful, Pratchett, Gaiman, and the Personification of Death by Peake v. Cannon. We read, there's a lot here to unpack, so I'm going to read through some of it. Death of the Diskworld seems to be quite sentimental when it comes to the subject of life. One might be forgiven for thinking that his penchant for saving lives started with the 8th book of the series during his mortal time as Bill Dorr, so the Reaper Man, right? But the most impactful of the people saved by Death of the Diskworld first appeared in the second Diskworld novel, The Light Fantastic, although Isabel, daughter of Death of the Diskworld, had a brief early appearance. We don't get to explore her life fully until the series' 4th book, Mort. Isabel's parents died when she and they were crossing a desert when she was a small child. Instead of leaving Isabel to die alone or personally collecting her soul himself, Death of the Diskworld saved her life. She aged normally into the age of 16 when Death of the Diskworld brought her to Death's domain to live with him as his daughter in his house. Mon Repo said to mean my place of rest in the Disquimian language. Isabel is the first person we know to have had their life saved by Death himself. When Death does have a human manservant named Albert, who is over 2,000 years old, Albert's near immortality is the result of a bargain he made with Death in order to avoid his own quickly approaching end. Albert is allowed to stay in the timeless realm of Death's domain in exchange for his companionship and servitude. But every time Albert returns to the disc, he is subject to the normal flow of time and thus inches closer to his inevitable death. So there's a bargain that's already been made there, an arrangement. Unlike Albert, Isabel struck no bargain with Death. She was brought into his domain by the actions of Death himself. She had no choice, and by the time that we see her in Mort, she's tired of her existence after spending 35 years trapped as an unaging 16-year-old with only an anthropomorphic personification and an elderly manservant for company. When Death takes on a young human boy, Mort, short for Mortimer, as an apprentice, Isabel is finally afforded someone her own age, by appearance at least, to spend time with. Okay, so what do we make of this? They go on and say, the saving of Isabel can be read as Death attempting to fulfill the course of a typical human life. He doesn't need a servant, but people with large estates typically have servants, so he has Albert. He understands that most tradesmen in pre-industrial societies take apprentices to allow them the opportunity to vacation, so he hires Mort. However, those professional relationships do not require emotional attachments. In the Pratchett co-author, The Folklore of Diskworld, readers are told Death has often tried to act in human ways as a relief from his unremitting memory of both past and future, but he rarely gets much satisfaction from it. He tends to get the details wrong. He understands offspring in the abstract, but he doesn't have the emotions, as Isabel laments to Mort, to feel anything for his child. He also halts her development at age 16, not understanding that perpetual puberty would be a nightmarish existence for almost any human. Death understands what family looks like, but not what one feels like. After Isabel and Mort develop feelings for each other, he finally realizes he must let them go, must let them both pursue the life his realm can't give them. So there is a growth process that is taking place there. What is foreign to death, but something that he engages with all the time and is curious about, he's gradually able to wrap his head around. Now, we also read that, as we know, on the disc, death is whoever does death's job. On a few occasions, others are given the powers of death, either by death or reality filling the position when he's left or been fired. The most notable of these, usually temporary deaths, are his apprentice Mort, the new death of Reaper Man, the death of Rats, and Death's granddaughter, Susan. Each of these stand-in deaths give the job of death a slightly different color and show the reader various philosophies of living and dying that provide a more nuanced appreciation of the character death, the main death. And I think that's a great insight right there. So sometimes it's by contrast. So for example, in Reaper Man, the death who's replaced him, too dramatic, right? And he doesn't like that. He's opposed to that. And we read this, there's a bit more about this in this particular piece. He's supplanted by the new death, who's been summoned into existence by the auditors of reality, and he's created to do his job in the opposite way that death does his. He takes pleasure in the ending of lives, the one reaction that death suggested would have disqualified Mort for the job. You should actually be sort of impartial, right? When he says he will enjoy ending death's life as Bill Dorr, New Death clarifies by saying the taking of one death is the same as achieving the end of 1 billion lesser lives. Even though he denies he sees the job as a game, it's clear the New Death does see the reaping of soul as a matter of numbers. So a very different philosophy on life and death, right? He also rejects becoming an individual, referring to himself as we, and refusing to assume any form more specific than a hovering robe with no figure inside, similar to the auditors. He does allow himself drama, which the former death abhors. New Death will always find a light source, preferably lightning, to appear against, and he will turn up at exactly midnight if at all possible. However, it's not New Death's enjoyment in the reaping, rejection of individuality, or even dramatic flair that most disgusts death of the Diskworld. It is the crown that New Death wears, which leads him to fight him and actually to destroy him. Later on, we learn that when Mort and Isabel die and choose to refuse Death's offer of remaining eternally in their final moment in his domain, Death finally experiences something akin to human grief. Despite his power, he still lost his daughter and his son-in-law to Death. Unsure how to deal with the memory of their deaths, Death of the Diskworld abandons his job to do what he thinks a human being would do. He takes up drinking and joins the Klachian Foreign Legion. But this has consequences. This is how Susan suddenly finds herself learning her true family lineage and being sucked into essentially being Death. Now, we learn about Susan from this piece as well, and there's some good takes on this that I think I largely agree with. Here's one of them. Although soul music introduces Susan, she really struggles to claim the hero status she would later gain. For the most part, she spends much of the novel as little more than a confused teen, learning the exact same lesson her father, Mort, needed to be taught during his brief turn as Death. She, like her father, makes the mistake of saving a life she was assigned to reap and must learn the consequences that come with disturbing the natural order. So Susan's learning is which things can be changed and which things must sadly be accepted, as it is with the deaths of her parents. And she also learns about belief, which is a topic that we'll talk about elsewhere. So she also starts to learn how to use her inherited powers and finds out that if Death can't do his job for one reason or another, she winds up being the delegate and having to take over for him. Now, we also learn twice more in Susan's life she's called upon to assist her grandfather, but with far greater stakes than she faced in soul music. Instead of just filling in by reaping souls, she has to defend her entire disc against her grandfather's old nemesis, the auditors of reality. So the first happens in Hogfather. They're targeting Hogfather. In the end, the big lie that the death says humans must believe in is not all that dissimilar from that of the auditors. Both want to believe in an orderly universe and assume order will give life meaning. So we get some more discussion of the auditors. And then we read a little bit later on, Susan only appears as the main character of one other novel, Thief of Time. Again, she must foil the auditors, this time against a plan that involves a perfect clock that will stop time. Here we see Susan as a fully realized and fully at peace character. She's not overjoyed when family duty calls, but she no longer fights who she is. She even uses her supernatural abilities to full effect in her new job as a teacher. And so in some respects, it's actually like the best depiction that we have of Susan, granddaughter of Death, sometimes stepping in to be Death herself. And here's the sum up for this piece. Taken as a whole, the various characters who take on the duty of Death tell the repeating story in which all human beings take part. We all start ignorant of both the grand questions of life and then of the fact that life must someday end. We all want to do our best to prolong both our lives and the lives around us, and this is a noble sign of compassion. However, the stories of these temporary deaths teach us that sometimes true empathy is not forcing life to linger where it shouldn't, that we are the only ones who can deliver justice and mercy to the world, and that death need not be a source of fear. They also teach us that children can and even must handle the realities of the world, and that we do them no favors by trying to sweeten bitter reality with inane fantasies, just so long as we remember to hold on to the important fantasies. So I really like that last set of reflections where, can we call it a didactic purpose? It is didactic in that it's teaching us something, Pratchett, through Death and his relations with the other deaths, many of whom are his family members, right? But it's not didactic as in being heavy-handed. The lesson is something that we have to kind of call out as, the author of that thesis, Kiki Cannon, did. And we move on finally to another piece, which is a master's thesis. Some genetics are passed on via the soul, the curious case of Susan Stowe-Hellett by Imola Bolgoldzi. So this is specifically focusing on Death's granddaughter, right? And this has to do with her being a fully realized female character. So there is a little bit of engagement with other authors who've talked about these things, as you would expect to see in an academic master's thesis. Here's where it starts. Haberkorn's insightful analysis of these characters brings to the forefront Pratchett's rejection of stereotypical patterns and his invention of new ones, which he classifies as political in the broader sense. He sums up the method as follows. Pratchett creates heroic palimpsests that interact with the tradition by means of repetition, amplification, or repudiation, while the earlier inscriptions can still be detected. This leaves one wondering how Susan Stowe-Hellett could have been disregarded in Haberkorn's analysis. Now, what is a palimpsest? So this is a technical term that comes out of manuscripts where you have a manuscript over which another manuscript has been written. Oftentimes the first manuscript, they did this in order to, you could say, save vellum or parchment or paper or, whatever it happened to be. They would scratch out the ink on top and then write something above it. But the older inscriptions would still remain there, and we can often recover these. So to say a text is a palimpsest means it's a text on a text. So what is Pratchett doing in a lot of cases? He is taking classic tropes and reworking them within a new story. So it goes on. Our first glimpse of Susan is in Soul Music through the eyes of the headmistress of the Quirm College for Young Ladies. As a 16-year-old academically brilliant at the things she liked doing, like logic and maths, there was something frankly unlovable about the child. She was brilliant in the same way a diamond is brilliant, all edges and chilliness. So, it says, the personality traits Susan demonstrates even before her ancestry is revealed stand in stark contrast with those expected of a teenage girl. To the great surprise of the headmistress, she doesn't cry when her parents die. She's often angry at the sheer stupidity of the world, and she hates literature, but is good at any of the sports played with a stick of some sort that needs swinging. Susan knows her own mind, is self-reliant but lonely, living on the periphery of the boarding school community due to the uncannily noiseless way she moves and her ability to fade from attention and be invisible in situations she wants to avoid. So, the conclusion here, it is clear from the very beginning, Pratchett aims to subvert the traditional figure of the teenage heroine, pretty, naive, and romantically inclined, and yet Susan's plotline is that of a Bildungsroman, so a development story, right, we could call it. So on the one hand, unconventional, on the other hand, kind of conventional. And going down a little bit further, as soon as Susan finds her purpose and starts exploring her power as death, her attitude towards conflicts and confrontations changes dramatically. Whereas previously she used to fade, wait till people forgot about her, then slip away, she is now more than ready to take on the challenges the saving of Imp E. Kellen presents, and is exasperated by the position of insignificance girls are relegated to in traditional societies. In The Education of a Witch, Tiffany Aching, Hermione Granger engendered magic in Diskworld and Potterworld. Janet Brennan Croft describes Ankh Moorcock as becoming not only multicultural, but experiencing an infiltration of women into traditionally male institutions, such as the City Watch, and into new fields such as the newspaper and clacks business. She cites Susan as an example, stating, even Death himself has a female apprentice, and assigns this role to her in all three novels she appears in. This is certainly the case in Soul Music, as she has a lot to learn, remember, and come to terms with, but it is not only the arrogance of youth that makes her say, what did he, Death, know about anything? He'd never lived. Susan has a valid point, one that in the end will make all the difference, but not before she experiences utter helplessness in the face of the mythical force of the music. And then, even though Susan's learning process continues in Hogfather and Thief of Time, there are several factors that point at her autonomy versus her position as Death's apprentice. First, in Soul Music, Susan almost instinctively does what she feels is right and has no idea that her help is instrumental in saving the world. Whereas in Hogfather, it is her astute detective work that takes her to the castle of the Tooth Fairy. In this case, it is her decision to face tea time to avert disaster, and she knows that the whole world's tomorrow is at risk while protecting the Hogfather, though she still finds it hard to believe. Secondly, in Hogfather, she performs tasks that death cannot accomplish, right? Going to that place, for example. Last but not least, she has skills unrelated to death's power, a keen analytic mind in human matters as well, and a great grasp of psychology, completely alien to the young Susan in Soul Music, but in Thief of Time, successfully tested against someone as experienced as Nanny Ogg. So we see she's not just Death's apprentice. She begins that way as well as being his granddaughter and stand-in, but she's developing into a major character of her own. In Thief of Time, Pratchett discusses in more detail the nature of Susan's existence, described very briefly as mostly human by the auditors in Hogfather. Up to this point, she is a unique Discworld character due to the combination of two halves of a powerful dichotomy, human and immortal, because, quote, some genetics are passed on via the soul, providing her with an understanding of both worlds. What may have started as a humorous inversion of roles in soul music, though not regarded by Andrew Butler in the Pocket Essentials Terry Pratchett as revolutionary in any way, based on his observation that, quote, Susan doesn't come across so much as Death as in drag as a half-hearted goth, has evolved into a complex character who displays an incongruous array of qualities, traditionally branded as gender-specific. Susan, in fact, is a great example of Pratchett's aim, defined by Francis Donovan and Was Terry Pratchett a Feminist, as, quote, revealing the absurdity of the cultural expectations of femininity while portraying the very real strength and value of women who buck those expectations. Susan's build, style, passion for quality chocolate, and way with children are regarded as feminine qualities, while her physical strength, fearlessness, prowess with sword, and keen analytical mind are traditionally considered masculine characteristics. Pratchett is composing, notice this term again, a palimpsest here, but one that overturns both round-world and Discworld gender stereotypes, resulting, we could say, in a much more powerful, richer character in Susan, part of Death's family. So this is, there's some really good stuff out there, thoughtful people reflecting on what Pratchett is doing in these death-centered books. And as we see, by the end of them, we're not just dealing with death anymore. Mort is an interesting character, but he's only showing up, in one volume, essentially. Susan is showing up in 3, and just as Death is developing, so is she, in ways that place them, you could say, at the center of cosmic struggles to save the Discworld and to understand their own place in that universe. So, a lot of useful stuff there, I think, coming from these 4 pieces. If you're hunting around for philosophical themes in speculative fiction, then actually one of the best authors you could find would be Terry Pratchett, because it almost seems like every 10 pages we have something new coming up, which then will be explored further in some of the later books, picking up, actually if we want to use sort of, since one of the books is all about music, the music, what has rocks in it, namely soul music, we could think about these as sort of like musical themes, variations, remixes that take place that add something new in, taking a tune and placing it in a different context, which makes it even larger. So, there's no way that we're going to get to every major philosophical theme, let alone all the minor ones, in a review here. So I've got some picked out that I thought were particularly striking, that maybe you will find very interesting as well. And we won't be doing quite so much referring to particular texts and passages, just because that takes a good bit of time, and we do want to keep this manageable. So the first one that I want to talk about is, we could call it a connection between metaphysics and ethics in this character, Death. There's an early discussion that happens between Death and his apprentice, Mort, very early on in the apprenticeship, where Mort is going to bring up questions of, well, is that just? Is that fair? And Death will say, there is no justice. There is only me, meaning that people have all sorts of ideas about justice, but that kind of doesn't matter in the end. Everybody has to die, and they're going to die in the way that they do. Now, does Death himself even follow this cosmic rule? No, he ends up making exceptions in some of these books. He breaks the rules or bends them from time to time. And there's a very interesting idea about rules and rule following that gets articulated, if I remember right, particularly in Thief of Time, but is there in the others. And I think if I remember right, Susan hears this from somebody else, picks up on it herself, that it's important, actually one of the monks too, the one who's supposed to be sort of a stand-in for Lao Tzu. It's important to know the rules because we would normally say, then you can follow them. Then you can, understand how they all fit together in a beautiful, comprehensive system. And yes, that is the case for some people, but not for these main characters. Because for these main characters, it's important to know the rules so you know when you're breaking them, or bending them, or violating them, or abrogating them, or whatever you want to say. And the rules don't go away, but they do provide a sort of structure to things. There's always, we don't have a descent into absolute contradiction or nonsense. We always have a logic there, but it's a logic that turns out to be complex and malleable, and that beings who have wills, who can think about things, can modify. So one great example of this, I think, is coming up already in the Mort book. So Death says you can't save somebody who's supposed to die because then you're interfering, right? You're monkeying around with the mechanics, the metaphysics of the world that you're in, and you'll screw up history. And we find, what does Mort do? Well, exactly that. He saves a princess who he thinks he's in love with, who, in the end, he's not. It's actually Death's daughter, Isabel, who he's going to fall in love with, who falls in love with him. But in any case, what we find out is, I'm going to make an exception here. I'm going to read a little bit. So he says, Mort thought history was thrashing around like a steel hawser with the tension off, twanging backwards and forwards across reality in great destructive sweeps. History isn't like that. History unravels gently like an old sweater. It has been patched and darned many times, reknitted to suit different people, shoved in a box under the sink of censorship to be cut up for the dusters of propaganda. Yet it always eventually manages to spring back into its old familiar shape. History has a habit of changing the people who think they are changing it. History always has a few tricks up its frayed sleeve. It's been around a long time. This is what was happening. Mort had, saved this princess, and now history has been changed. The misplaced stroke of Mort's scythe had cut history into two separate realities. In the city of Stolat, Princess Kelly still ruled with a certain amount of difficulty and with the full-time aid of the royal recognizer, who was put on the court payroll in charge of the duty that remembering that she existed. In the lands outside, though, beyond the plain and the ram tops around the Circle Sea and all the way to the rim, the traditional reality still held sway, and she was quite definitely dead. The Duke was king, and the world was proceeding sedately according to plan, whatever that was. The point is that both realities were true. The sort of historical event horizon was currently about 20 miles away from the city and wasn't yet very noticeable. That's because call it the difference in historical pressures, wasn't yet very great, but it was growing. Out in the damp cabbage fields, there was a shimmer in the air and a faint sizzle like frying grasshoppers. People don't alter history any more than birds alter the sky. They just make brief patterns in it, inch by inch, implacable as a glacier and far colder, the real reality was grinding back towards Stolat. So what we see here is a different model, we could say, of time and history and reality than those where people are like, oh, butterfly effect. If you change one thing, who knows what consequences? History steers itself back. And it's aided by the fact, something we talked about before, that humans are great at overlooking and forgetting and misremembering things as well. So we have this common theme of somebody is saved. In the first case, it's Mort, who is, acting as Death's apprentice, as a stand-in for him, and he screws up, and he tries to fix it, and of course, he can't fix it. And, we're all familiar with this sort of theme, both from literature and from our own lives and misadventures. Then, who does it next? Well, Death himself in Reaper Man. And technically speaking, you could say that when he does it, he's no longer Death, who is screwing things up, monkeying around with history, saving a girl from a burning building, making sure that she doesn't die there. But he is still Death, right? He's that entity, and he is violating his own rules in this case, isn't he? Then we get somebody else. Susan Stolat in Soul Music is going to save one of the not major, not minor characters, nicknamed Buddy, whose name is actually Imp E. Kellen, who finds his life is being extended by this magical instrument and the music that it generates, which drives everybody wild and creates a new scene of the music that has rock in it, right? Rock music. So that's going to be another one of these cases. We see it over and over again. Rules, they're not meant to be broken. They're not made to be broken, but they are broken. And one main way this happens is by centering on a particular character. And then it creates all sorts of ripple effects. And, by the time that we get to Hogfather and Thief of Time, although we already have this going on to some degree, being mentioned at the end of Reaper Man, the auditors, those non-living, pre-life beings who have a certain kind of life of their own, who want the universe to go in an orderly way, they don't like all these violations, but they also don't completely understand the reality that they're pushing against and actually trying to destroy. Interestingly, in Thief of Time, we find out that the auditors, by trying to create this clock that will essentially conserve and destroy and change time itself, are using the agency of human beings, which they've already done in Hogfather by hiring the assassin, Mr. Tea Time, or Tea Time, if we want to be exact, to interfere with things, right? And we're going to find that Susan and Death and others are going, the monks are going to be opposed to these auditors, but one of them, because they take on human corporeality in Thief of Time, one of them, the one who's done it longest, is actually going to turn against them, and they turn on each other. So we have, a lot of different models of the universe, of time, of history being worked in here. But, here's what I'll leave off with this. Coming back to the making an exception, changing the application of the rules by saving a person. Human beings are beings that can not just randomly zig rather zag, but can, however misguidedly, make decisions with something like a free will. We don't have to be committed to some big metaphysical notion of free will, but that's enough to bollocks things up, to introduce a wrench into the workings of causality. And so that is, with all these different moving parts, one of the big philosophical themes that I would say is being explored here. And it has not just a metaphysical, but all sorts of ethical dimensions to it. Should you save somebody? What's going to happen? Do you value the entire world as a system, or do you value this one person over here? You know, if you're death, really the one person should decline in favor of the system. But we see that even death and his granddaughter and his apprentice will make exceptions from time to time. You know, one of the aspects of this as well is that there is a determinism. We see that death has a library in which everybody's life is written out. Each of them has an hourglass, so there's a kind of mechanics to it. And nevertheless, exceptions can be made. You can add some time to somebody's hourglass. You can flip it over and start them anew. So there's all sorts of interesting possibilities. And human beings can make choices about it. As Susan's parents, Isabel and Mort do, given the choice to not die and to exist in a kind of immortality, they choose death. They choose an ending to it. They make an ethical choice. So that's one big theme. I would say another really, really interesting theme is learning and developing. And who does this happen to the most? I mean, let's start with who it doesn't happen to the most, but where it is still quite momentous. So, you know, Isabel, Death's adopted daughter, she learns things along the way. She's been kept in a sort of perpetual adolescence, long past adolescence. She wants to get out in the world and experience things. We have Mort, this fairly hapless but good-natured guy who is hired as Death's apprentice. Even Albert, the great 2,000-year-old wizard, develops along the way. Of course, we have the character Susan Stow-Helot in these three books, changing quite a bit from book to book, not only in terms of her age and her profession, but also in her attitude towards being a human being or being part of the family business. She really does have an arc, we could say. The Death of Rats, arguably, learns some things along the way. He comes in Reaper Man and then is important after that. But who develops and who learns the most? Death himself. Death has been affected by human beings. Once he has an apprentice in Mort, now he's experienced some things, he's eaten food before. Having an apprentice affords him the opportunity to go off and try some new things, to see what human beings, what do they enjoy, and can he enjoy them? He tries drinking, he tries fishing. You know, these don't actually do that much for him. But then, even more so, in Reaper Man, he's been relieved of his duties. He's going to himself die. He can go off and take up jobs. At first, you know, working in a restaurant, not very good for him. But turns out he's awfully great with a scythe and can be a good farmhand. And then, of course, resumes his job at the very end when he fights the new death and, saves the day in the universe, you could say. And then we see him... Well, actually, there's a great line at the end. At the very end, he is talking to the Death of Rats, and he says, "I can't let you remain. It's not as though I'm running a franchise or something." And the Death of Rats opens a tiny skeletal hand. The tiny Death of Fleas stood up looking embarrassed but hopeful, and Death says, "No, this shall not be. I am implacable. I am Death alone." He looked at the Death of Rats, Then he remembered the great death of the universe, Azrael in his Tower of Loneliness. The death of rats looked at him, squeak. And then they have a discussion. No, you can't ride a cat. Whoever heard of the death of rats riding a cat? The death of rats would ride some kind of dog, right? And so he decides to allow the death of rat and the death of fleas to be, going on. But before that, he encounters the death, that he is only, you might say, a figment or a fragment of Azrael, right? The death of the universe. And death himself is growing, is learning. And it doesn't, there's no point where like everything clicks and death is now fully human and gets it. But there's no humans that fully get it either. And we see further developments happening, in soul music, particularly in Hogfather. Death is going to take on the mantle of the Hogfather and learn all sorts of things about children, about presence, about the mechanics of how things work. Susan, of course, is developing as well. And then as Death puts the band back together in Thief of Time, the band being the original 4 or 5 horsemen, he's thinking about things. He's learning even more about who he is, the cosmos that he's in, and his own family, including his connection with Susan. So there's a lot of interesting development and learning and growth that's happening in here. And I should point out one other thing about this theme. Sometimes it's not the right lesson, but the wrong lesson that is being initially, or even for the most part, learned. And I would say some of the interactions that are happening in Thief of Time between the various monks illustrate this. These are people who are supposed to be super wise, learning all sorts of things. And oftentimes it turns out that what you're learning is just some homespun wisdom that this great monk got from this landlady over here, and there's a lot of truisms. We should say that this also does apply to the characters of the wizards in the Unseen University, who learn some interesting stuff along the way about themselves and about the universe. So that's another very interesting and important philosophical theme. I would also like to briefly mention one other character who's kind of learning things along the way, who is a wizard who, in the beginning of Reaper Man, dies and is buried and won't stay dead because death has left the scene, right? So human beings aren't dying and staying dead as they should, and that is Wendell Pons, who finds out all sorts of things about life as a undead member who can now truly enjoy being alive, and at the very end of the story, also being dead. You could say that his fellow wizards and all the other undead that he interacts with are not necessarily undead, but weird creatures figure into that as well. I do also want to talk about some similarities and differences with these characters who parallel each other to a certain degree. We find out in Hogfather that there's kind of an interesting parallel between Susan and Mr. Teatime, but she actually, will end up killing him in the very end. We have in Thief of Time Jeremy Clarkson and Lobsang Lud, who turn out to be not twins, but the same person born twice. And they come together at the very end. They are the children of Time herself and a monk from way, way back who somehow, she fell in love with her, got her pregnant, and then she has these children. So there's a lot of really interesting, you could say, speculations going on there. And where I want to finish up is in particular talking about soul music, so and parody. we've talked about this before. Pratchett's works are humorous, so that places him in a interesting genre of speculative fiction, which, I don't know what the name for it is, but it's funny stuff where it's both serious and funny at the same time. Lots of jokes, lots of puns. And, who would the other standout authors that we could compare Pratchett be in that respect? The ones that come to mind for me would be Douglas Adams with his Hitchhiker's Guide and his other writings as well, Dirk Gently's Detective Agency, and Piers Anthony and the vast Xanth series as well. So Pratchett likes to make all sorts of jokes, puns, take things that we take seriously, twist them around. And sometimes it's just, one particular thing, and sometimes it's an entire scene, we could say. So soul music is about the development of rock music, or as they call it in this book, the music that has rocks in it. And we get to see all these interesting parodies of things that actually do happen in the music scene from, the late 1950s all the way through the 1980s. For example, the rise of punk bands who aren't very talented but have the right look and make a lot of noise, to musicians for whom somehow the magic power, actually it's not even magic, it's a different power than magic, is able to do something that, makes people lose their minds in some respect, And there's actually a interesting discussion of the difference that's happening there. The wizards are trying to figure it out. There's others that are speculating about it. I'm not finding the exact passage, which I thought I had set aside. But the point is, music itself has a force, has a power, a capacity that occupies some of the same space as magic in this universe. And we get all the other sort of cliches and tropes, big concerts being put on, Cut My Throat Dibbler, who's sort of the consummate music manager who takes a lot of money and knows everybody and pulls all the right strings and doesn't care at all for the music that he's promoting. Sort of a Don Arden type in many respects. And I think that this is a very, very interesting volume in this sequence because of that. So that's really an important philosophical theme as well. I'll just read you one kind of funny thing. So this is one of the bands that's not particularly good. We need it get it together if we're going to go wow them at the festival. What? You mean like learn to play, said Jimbo? No, music with rocks in just happens. If you go around learning, you'll never get anywhere. So, the idea is you just let the music move you, even if you're not particularly talented musically. So, those are a few of the philosophical themes within these 5 volumes that are the Death books. All of these together, they comprise sort of a sub-story that intersects with all the other stories of the Diskworld. And what I am going to close on, in addition to saying, wow, wonderful books, hope that you enjoy them as much as I do, is one of the things that I find particularly endearing about Death personally. And I think it's perfectly fine when we're talking about Pratchett to end on an idiosyncratic note like this, is his, what should we call it, love, appreciation for, enjoyment of, protective attitude towards one particular animal. We've already hinted at this before. Cats. Somebody who likes cats in the way that Death does, can't be all bad.